My name is Nora. I'm 32, and if you told me years ago I'd be standing in my own Seattle apartment, keys in hand, surrounded by walls I paid for with my own blood and sweat, I would have laughed. Not because it was impossible, but because for most of my life I felt like the outsider in my own family, a shadow no one cared to notice. The black sheep of a household polished with prestige and pride, except none of that pride was ever meant for me. I grew up in a well-to-do suburb outside Seattle, in a home that looked perfect from the outside. My parents, both cardiologists, filled the house with awards and framed certificates, their names engraved in gold. Strangers might have thought our lives were flawless, that I was lucky to be raised in a house where ambition ran like electricity through every corner. But electricity burns when it doesn't flow toward you. From the moment my younger twin brothers, Thomas and Mason, entered the world, I seemed to fade into wallpaper. I was 6, sitting at the kitchen table with my legs dangling off the chair when I noticed it for the first time. The birthday cake was cut, the slices handed out. My brothers' plates overflowed with frosting and thick layers while I got the crumbly edge. Nobody noticed. Nobody apologized. It was just normal. By 10, the pattern was carved into stone. When the boys got shiny new bikes, mine was a hand-me-down with a squeaky chain, paint peeling, the kind that made you embarrassed to ride through the neighborhood. My father patted the twins on the shoulders, beaming with pride as they showed off their tricks. I trailed behind, wobbling, invisible. Vacations were no different. If Thomas wanted kayaking, we were out on Puget Sound the next morning. If Mason wanted hiking, we'd be climbing Mount Rainier before I could even blink. When I timidly asked once if we could visit an art gallery in the city, my mom brushed me off, barely hearing me over Mason's chatter about trail gear. "Maybe next time, Nora," she muttered, already packing snacks for the hike. But next time never came. At night, I would lie awake in my little room, staring at the ceiling and wondering why. Why their laughter echoed down the halls while mine was always swallowed. Why their achievements were framed while my drawings ended up in the trash. The question chewed on me, night after night. What did I do wrong? Why wasn't I enough? The answer, or maybe the escape, came when I was 11. A school trip took me to the Seattle Art Museum. I remember trailing behind my classmates, distracted by something in a corner room. A woman stood before a canvas, gently brushing away layers of grime. The painting's colors slowly emerged, reds and blues as vivid as fresh flowers after rain. My heart skipped. It was like magic. She was restoring life to something forgotten. I stood frozen, eyes wide, feeling as though she wasn't just restoring the painting, but me. That day, I found what I wanted to be. An art restorer. Someone who made broken things beautiful again. I went home giddy, sketching for hours in my notebook, copying what I had seen. When my 12th birthday came around, I begged my parents for an art kit. Nothing fancy, just paints, brushes, something to begin my journey. I ripped the wrapping paper open, my heart pounding. But inside the box was a math workbook. Practical, my mom called it, barely glancing up from her medical charts. "Art's a hobby, Nora, not a future," she said flatly. From across the table, Thomas smirked as he unwrapped his brand new gaming console. Mason leaned over to check it out, already planning their next round of games. My stomach twisted, but I swallowed the lump in my throat, shoving the workbook under my bed that night. I didn't cry. I just sat there sketching on scrap paper, pretending I didn't care. But I did. High school didn't make things easier. By then, the favoritism wasn't subtle. It was glaring, relentless, and humiliating. My brothers were sent to private academies, dressed in crisp uniforms, chauffeured by my parents like young princes. Their tuition was a non-issue, their extracurriculars fully funded. Meanwhile, I trudged to public school with secondhand textbooks, quietly patching together my education. Family dinners became a theater of comparison. My dad boomed about Thomas's soccer goals and Mason's debate trophies while I sat silent, a ghost at the table. If I spoke up about winning a small art contest at school, it was brushed aside with a distracted, "That's nice, Nora," before the spotlight swung back to the twins. The only person who truly saw me was Grandma Rose. She lived in Olympia in a cozy cottage filled with the smell of old books and the crackle of vinyl records. Unlike my parents, she didn't ask me to be anyone other than myself. One rainy afternoon when I was 14, she handed me a small box. Inside was a modest art kit, paints, brushes, a sketch pad. My breath caught. "You've got a gift, Nora," she whispered, her eyes soft with conviction. "Don't let anyone tell you it's not enough." I hugged her so tightly, I thought I might break her frail shoulders. That kit became my lifeline. Whenever the weight of my parents' indifference crushed me, I would pull it out, pressing paint to paper, creating worlds where I mattered. But at home, the contrast was unbearable. The boys' accomplishments were announced like breaking news, while mine barely registered. Even on vacations, I'd be scribbling sketches in the back seat, ignored as my parents debated which resort activity best suited Thomas and Mason. They never asked what I wanted, not once. I remember one particular evening, sitting in my room with the door closed, the muffled sound of my brothers laughing downstairs. I dipped my brush into paint, dragging it across the page, imagining myself standing in a gallery one day, surrounded by canvases I had restored. In my fantasy, strangers admired my work, and maybe, just maybe, my parents would finally look at me with pride. But deep down I knew, their pride wasn't meant for me, and that knowledge hardened into something sharp, determination. If they wouldn't see me, I would make sure the world did. The invisible daughter was learning how to fight for her own spotlight, and soon she would discover just how much it would cost. By the time I was 15, the divide in our household was a canyon I could never cross. Thomas and Mason wore pressed uniforms from their private academy, their backpacks stuffed with new textbooks and gadgets. I stood at the bus stop with my thrift store jeans and a pile of secondhand books, pretending not to notice the difference. My parents never said it outright, but their message was clear. Investment was reserved for the twins. I tried to bury myself in art. Hours in the school studio, charcoal staining my fingers, the smell of paint clinging to my clothes. It was the only place I felt alive. Teachers would linger over my work, murmuring that I had an eye for restoration, a gift for bringing faded sketches back to life. Their praise was quiet, but meant more to me than any of the trophies lined up in my brother's rooms. At dinner one evening, I tried to share. Mrs. Jenkins told me I should consider a career in art restoration. She thinks I really have. My mother cut me off without looking up from her tablet. "Art is a nice hobby, Nora, but it's not a career." My father barely looked up from his laptop. "Be practical." Thomas chuckled. "Yeah, maybe you can paint us all when we're famous doctors." The table erupted in laughter, except for me. I sat still, cheeks burning, pushing peas around my plate. Inside, something snapped. If they wouldn't believe in me, I would believe in myself twice as hard. When college applications rolled around, the favoritism became brutal. My parents hired tutors for Thomas and Mason, toured Ivy League campuses with them, paid thousands for prep courses. Me? I filled out applications alone in my room, applying to state schools with art programs, leaning on scholarships I wasn't even sure I could win. The day I got my acceptance letter, I remember bursting into the living room, waving the paper like a victory flag. I got in, a scholarship for art restoration at Washington State. My mom glanced up from her coffee. "That's nice, honey." My dad didn't even lift his eyes from the newspaper. "Did you hear Thomas and Mason aced their AP exams?" I stood frozen, the letter trembling in my hand, their words slicing through me sharper than any blade. I went back to my room, shut the door, and let myself cry into my pillow. But that night, through the tears, I made a promise. I'd prove them wrong. The day I left for college, my suitcase was stuffed with thrift store clothes and my battered old laptop. My parents didn't even drive me to campus. Their hospital shifts were too demanding, they said. I stood on the curb, feeling more like a runaway than a daughter, when a familiar old hatchback pulled up. Grandma Rose stepped out, her silver hair catching the morning light. She wrapped me in her arms, and for the first time in weeks, I felt steady. "My girl," she whispered, slipping an envelope into my hand. Inside was a check, not life-changing, but enough to cover my first semester's books. But it wasn't the money. It was her belief in me. "You're going to shine, Nora," she said firmly. "Don't ever let them dim that." I clutched her words like armor as she drove me to campus. College was freedom and struggle braided together. My scholarship covered tuition, but everything else, food, rent, supplies, was on me. Nights blurred into shifts at a campus coffee shop, wiping down tables until my feet ached, then dragging myself home to study. Sometimes dinner was nothing more than instant noodles, and I'd whisper a prayer that my laptop wouldn't die mid-project. But when I stepped into the art restoration studio, all of that vanished. There was something holy about coaxing color back from a cracked canvas, peeling away years of dust to reveal a painting's hidden soul. It felt like I was restoring myself piece by piece. I'd spend weekends haunting the museum, peppering staff with questions about solvents, brushes, varnishes. Every answer fed my fire. Every restored painting reminded me that beauty could survive neglect, that maybe so could I. My first big test came in junior year, an internship at a small Seattle museum. It wasn't glamorous. I swept floors, cataloged dusty artifacts, and carried stacks of records heavier than me, but it was my foot in the door and I was thrilled. I called home, bouncing with excitement. "Mom, I got the internship at the museum!" Her response was flat. "That's nice, Nora. Did you know Mason is presenting at a medical conference next month?" I gripped the phone so tightly my knuckles turned white. "That's great," I whispered, and hung up. The cracked ceiling of my dorm stared back at me as anger churned in my chest. It wasn't just neglect anymore, it was deliberate. They didn't care if I drowned, as long as the twins swam. The only thing that kept me afloat was Grandma Rose. Letters arrived in her looping handwriting, filled with small stories about her garden or her book club drama, sometimes a few dollars tucked inside, enough for groceries, but always encouragement. "You're doing what you love, Nora," she wrote once. "That's more than most can say. Don't let anyone steal that joy." Her words stitched me back together whenever I felt like unraveling. By my final year, I finally got to work on a real project, restoring a faded landscape from the 1800s. For weeks, I hovered over the canvas, carefully coaxing greens and blues back to life. Each brush stroke felt like unearthing a buried truth. One evening, I called home, desperate for some recognition. "Dad, I'm restoring a piece from the 1800s. It's incredible work." He cut me off. "Sounds like a lot of work for not much pay." I didn't call again. Graduation was supposed to be triumphant. I walked across the stage, diploma in hand, scanning the crowd. My parents were there, but their expressions were flat, distracted, as though they were attending out of obligation. At dinner afterward, in a generic chain restaurant, my father asked, "So, Nora, what's next?" I straightened my shoulders. "I got a job offer at a museum in Seattle. It's entry level, but it's a start." He frowned. "Seattle's expensive. How much does it pay?" I mumbled the modest salary, and their faces said it all. Disappointment. Meanwhile, Thomas and Mason were already lined up for medical school, their futures paved in gold. My victory felt like a failure under their gaze. But outside, Grandma Rose caught me before I left. She pressed another envelope into my palm, her eyes warm. "Don't let them dull your spark, my girl." Inside was enough for a deposit on a tiny Seattle apartment. I hugged her, tears stinging, and whispered, "I'll make it work. I promise." And for the first time in my life, I believed I would. Seattle felt like both a battlefield and a sanctuary. My new museum job was hardly glamorous. Most days, I cleaned frames, cataloged artifacts, and logged endless inventory sheets. The pay barely covered rent and groceries. My apartment was so small that if you stretched your arms out, you could almost touch both walls. Still, I woke up every morning knowing I was surrounded by art, and that was enough to keep me going. But the loneliness was heavy. For years, I had poured myself into my work, filling the emptiness with canvases and colors. It wasn't until Lucas walked into my life that I realized how starved I was for someone to truly see me. I met him at a coffee shop on Capitol Hill during one of my rare breaks. He sat across the room, typing furiously on his laptop, headphones hanging lopsided around his neck. When the barista mixed up our orders, he slid a latte onto my table with an apologetic grin. "Looks like fate wanted us to swap." We talked for an hour that first day, then 3 hours the next. Lucas was a web designer, hustling to build his own client list. He wasn't rich, wasn't polished, but he was alive with ideas. He knew what it meant to start from nothing, to build brick by brick with no safety net. His parents worked in a Tacoma shipyard, and he carried their grit in his bones. For the first time, I didn't feel like I had to apologize for my dreams. Lucas understood the fight, the hunger, the exhaustion of chasing something others dismissed as impossible. Together, we were underdogs, and together, we were unstoppable. A year into dating, he asked to meet my family. I froze. Every instinct screamed no. I pictured my parents' tight smiles, the cutting questions, the dismissive glances, but Lucas, ever hopeful, thought maybe they just needed to see what I saw in him. So we went. Their dining room was pristine, silver polished, the air heavy with quiet judgment. My brothers lounged at the table like they owned the place, smirking as Lucas pulled out a chair for me. My father leaned forward, his voice low but sharp. So, Lucas, what's your 5-year plan? Lucas shifted, steadying himself, his hand finding mine under the table. I'm building my client list. It's slow, but I'm making progress. Every month gets better. My mother's voice cut in, cold and precise. And your income? Can it support a family? Heat rushed to my cheeks. Mom! Lucas squeezed my hand. It's okay, Nora. He met her gaze. I'm not where I want to be yet, Dr. Torres, but I'm working hard. I believe in what I'm building. The interrogation went on like that, question after question, each one a veiled insult. By dessert, the spark in Lucas's eyes had dimmed. I wanted to scream, to flip the table, to tell them that this man saw me more clearly than they ever had. But I stayed silent, my fury locked behind clenched teeth. As we were leaving, my mother pulled me aside. Her voice dropped to a whisper, sharp enough to slice. Don't tie yourself to someone going nowhere, Nora. You've already chosen a tough career. Don't make it worse. Her words lodged in me like a splinter I couldn't pull out. Lucas wasn't the problem. They were. When Lucas proposed 6 months later, I didn't hesitate. We had no illusions of grandeur. Our savings barely stretched far enough for a small ceremony at a community center. I imagined fairy lights strung by friends, a homemade cake, wildflowers in mismatched vases. It wouldn't be lavish, but it would be ours. Swallowing my pride, I called my parents. We've set a date. It's nothing fancy, but maybe you could help with something small? The silence was deafening. Then my mom's voice, clipped and cool. Nora, you're an adult. If you chose this path, you handle it. I hung up, tears stinging my eyes, but not surprised. Grandma Rose, as always, stepped in. I can't give you a fairy tale wedding, she told me over the phone, but I want your day to be special. A small check arrived in the mail, enough to cover extra flowers, a thrifted dress that made me feel beautiful, and strings of fairy lights. The wedding day was simple but perfect. Our friends showed up early, hanging lights, scattering petals, baking cupcakes. When I walked down the aisle, Lucas's smile lit up the room, and for a moment, the rest of the world disappeared. My parents came, stiff and uncomfortable, their disapproval clinging to them like perfume. I overheard my mother whispering to my father about the cheap decorations. Thomas and Mason spent most of the evening in the corner, snickering at their phones. But I focused on Lucas, on our vows, on the friends who had shown up not out of duty, but love. For a fleeting night, I thought I could let go of the weight of my family's rejection. Until the next morning. My phone buzzed with notifications, dozens of them. Thomas and Mason had posted photos from the wedding online, captions like knives. Congrats to our big sis on her budget bash, Thomas wrote beneath a blurry picture of our cake. Dollar store vibes for Nora's big day, Mason added under a photo of our fairy lights. The worst was a side-by-side comparison, our modest buffet against a lavish restaurant meal. Captioned, Nora's wedding versus our usual lunch. Guess which is which? The comments were brutal. Some relatives laughed along. A few, like Aunt Betty, called it cruel. When I confronted my parents, their response was a breezy, boys will be boys. I didn't call back. I didn't scream. I just blocked them all. But inside, something was shifting. Because you can only be invisible for so long before you decide to be seen, even if it means burning bridges behind you. And I had no idea just how much fire was about to come. 5 months passed after the wedding before the next battle came. By then, Lucas and I had settled into the rhythm of married life. Small victories, bills stacked against the fridge, nights spent laughing in our cramped apartment. I had almost convinced myself I could keep my distance from the chaos of my family. But the Torres family reunion loomed like a storm cloud. It was always a grand affair, hosted in hotel ballrooms with rented chandeliers and distant cousins I could barely remember. Lucas thought attending might smooth things over. Maybe if they see us together again, things will change, he said gently. I wasn't so sure. My family didn't change. Still, a part of me hoped for one small crack in the wall they'd built around me. So I agreed. The Seattle hotel ballroom buzzed with chatter when we arrived, relatives clustered at tables, plates already heaped with food. I plastered on a smile, shaking hands, making small talk. But every step I took, I felt the weight of my parents' eyes across the room. My brother's laughter rose above the crowd, sharp and mocking. I tried to avoid them, drifting from conversation to conversation, but it was impossible to ignore Thomas bragging loudly near the buffet. Whistler was amazing, he said, holding court with a cluster of cousins, all paid for by Mom and Dad, of course, wouldn't travel any other way. Laughter rippled through the group. Something inside me snapped. I stepped forward, my voice louder than I intended. Must be nice, Thomas, having Mom and Dad bankroll your whole life. The room fell silent. Every conversation stopped mid-sentence. Forks hovered in the air. Thomas blinked, caught off guard. What's that supposed to mean? My heart pounded, but the words poured out like a flood I'd been holding back for years. It means you and Mason get everything. Private schools, new cars, $700,000 for your degrees. And me? I got a math workbook for my birthday and $100 for my wedding. Gasps rippled through the crowd. My mother's face turned crimson. Nora, you're being dramatic. We've always treated you equally. I laughed, the sound bitter and raw. Equally? I went to public school with secondhand textbooks while they had private tutors. I scraped through college on scholarships while you paid for their Ivy League lives. Don't you dare tell me it was equal. My father's voice dropped low, cold enough to freeze the air. You're embarrassing yourself. Stop this now. But I couldn't stop. Years of silence, of being erased, had built to this eruption. No, you're embarrassing yourselves. Pretending this family is fair. Pretending you didn't choose favorites. Thomas crossed his arms, smirking. You've always been jealous, Nora. That's your problem. Jealous? My voice cracked, then steadied with fury. You've never worked for anything. Everything was handed to you, and you act like it makes you superior. You don't even realize how pathetic that is. Mason chuckled under his breath. Wow, here comes Nora's victim speech. It might have spiraled into chaos, if not for the voice that cut through the air. Enough. Grandma rose. She rose slowly from her seat, small but unshakable, her cane tapping against the polished floor. The entire room stilled. Her eyes, usually soft with warmth, burned with disappointment. I've watched this family tear Nora down for years, she said, her voice carrying farther than I thought possible. And I am ashamed. My mother opened her mouth, but Grandma Rose raised a hand. No, don't you dare deny it. I was there when you dismissed her dreams, when you poured money into the boys and told her she was chasing nonsense. I was there when you mocked her choices and belittled her husband, and I am done watching it happen. The crowd shifted uneasily. Aunts and uncles avoided eye contact. Cousins exchanged glances, some nodding, some looking guilty. You favored Thomas and Mason, and it is breaking this family apart, she continued. Her hand trembled slightly, but her voice did not. You may think money makes you proud parents, but pride without love is nothing, nothing. Silence hung heavy, broken only by the clink of a glass set down too hard. My father's jaw tightened. Mother, you're overreacting. I am not. Her cane struck the floor once, sharp as a gavel. I am old enough not to care what anyone thinks of me, and I will say this plainly. Nora deserves better. She always has. A wave of murmurs swept the room. Aunt Betty's eyes met mine, soft with sympathy. A few cousins nodded in agreement. For once, I wasn't alone. But Thomas and Mason only smirked, as if it were all some amusing spectacle. I looked at Lucas, who squeezed my hand. Then I turned back to my family, my voice steadier than it had ever been. I'm done. I didn't wait for their response. I grabbed Lucas's hand and walked out, each step lighter than the last, though my chest still shook with adrenaline. Behind me, the ballroom buzzed with whispers. My parents' voices rising in anger, Grandma Rose's cane tapping defiantly. By the time we stepped into the night air, I felt like I could finally breathe. The Seattle skyline glittered above us, sharp and cold, but for the first time in years, the weight pressing on my chest had lifted. I had spoken, I had been heard, but deep down, I knew this was only the beginning. Families don't fracture cleanly. There are always splinters, sharp edges, and people who refuse to let go. And mine was far from finished with me. In the months after the reunion, I tried to stitch my life back together. The confrontation had left cracks across the family, but strangely, I felt lighter. For once, the weight wasn't mine alone. Grandma Rose's words still echoed in my head. Nora deserves better. It was the first time anyone had said that out loud. Meanwhile, Lucas's design firm was finally gaining traction. He had landed a contract with a small startup, and within weeks, more clients followed. Money stopped being a daily fear, and for the first time since I left college, I exhaled without tasting panic. We moved into a small but cozy apartment in Capitol Hill, sunlight streaming through tall windows, hardwood floors worn but charming. There was even a corner nook I claimed as my art space, where brushes and half-finished sketches littered the table. "Feels like home, doesn't it?" Lucas said, wrapping his arms around me as we stood among unpacked boxes. "It does," I whispered, though part of me feared it was too good to last. For a while, it was perfect. We hosted Grandma Rose often. She'd sit by the window with tea, watching the rain streak down the glass, smiling at the sight of us bustling in the kitchen. "You've built something real here," she told me once, her hands warm as they held mine. Not everyone can say that. Her presence filled the rooms with safety, a kind of love I'd never known from my parents. We laughed, cooked simple dinners, listened to her stories about the past. Those evenings felt like the family I had always wanted, small, imperfect, but true. Then, one evening, the knock came. No, more like a pounding. Lucas and I exchanged a glance. "Expecting someone?" he asked. I shook my head. The door swung open before I could answer, and Thomas and Mason stormed in, their faces twisted with rage. "You manipulative little witch," Thomas spat, jabbing a finger at me. "We saw your post, flaunting this apartment with Grandma like you earned it." I blinked, stunned. "What are you talking about?" Mason sneered, pacing like a predator. "Don't play dumb. You think we don't know she's funding this little setup? Cozying up to her for the inheritance?" My stomach dropped. "This place? Lucas and I earned every penny. Grandma had nothing to do with it." "Sure," Mason drawled, his voice dripping with contempt. "Can't wait for the old lady to croak so you two can sell her house and roll in the cash." The words hit like a slap. Before I could respond, a gasp echoed from behind us. Grandma Rose stood in the doorway of the guest room, her face pale, her eyes wide with horror. She had come over earlier to stay the weekend. "So that's how you feel," she whispered, voice steady but laced with pain. "To you, I'm just a paycheck waiting to die." Thomas stammered, "Grandma, wait, we didn't mean—" But she raised a trembling hand. "Enough." Her gaze cut through them like glass. "I have heard enough. I know now who values me and who doesn't." Silence swallowed the room. I turned to my brothers, my anger boiling over into clarity. "Get out." Thomas's jaw clenched. Mason muttered something under his breath, but they both slunk toward the door, still glaring at me as though I had betrayed them. When the door slammed shut, the air felt shattered. Grandma Rose lowered herself onto the couch, her hands shaking. I sat beside her, wrapping my arms around her fragile frame. She leaned into me, whispering, "I never thought they'd say something like that." Lucas knelt at her feet, his voice soft but firm. "You don't deserve that, Rose. Not from anyone." Tears prickled my eyes. I wanted to scream, to call my parents and throw the words in their faces. But what good would it do? They'd excuse it, like always. "They're just upset. They didn't mean it." No, they did mean it, and Grandma had heard it with her own ears. That night, after Grandma had fallen asleep in the guest room, I sat awake in the dark. Lucas touched my shoulder. "You okay?" I shook my head. "No, but I think I'm finally seeing them for who they really are." The next morning, my phone lit up with calls and texts. Dozens of missed messages from my parents, from Thomas, from Mason. Finally, against my better judgment, I answered one. "Nora," my mother's voice snapped, sharp as ever, "you need to talk to your grandmother. The boys didn't mean what they said." I laughed, bitter and cold. "They broke into my home and told her they can't wait for her to die. Don't tell me they didn't mean it." My father's tone was softer, calculated. "Think of the family, Nora. Your brothers deserve her support." That was it. Deserve. The words seared through me. I clenched the phone so tightly I thought it might crack. "After years of you ignoring me, belittling Lucas, excusing their cruelty, you have the audacity to say they deserve her support?" My voice rose, trembling with fury. "No, I'm done. Don't call again." I hung up, blocked the numbers, and set the phone down with shaking hands. Lucas wrapped me in his arms. "You did the right thing." But it didn't feel like relief. It felt like cutting away a piece of myself, raw and bleeding. Necessary, but brutal. Over the next days, Grandma Rose stayed close. She walked with me to the market, brewed tea in the mornings, filled the apartment with her laughter despite the shadow that lingered. "You're stronger than you think, Nora," she told me quietly one night. "I wish your parents had seen that sooner, but I see it now." Her words were a balm, but they couldn't erase the wound left by my brother's cruelty. Because once someone shows you what they truly are, you can never unsee it. And my family had just shown me the darkest part of themselves. After that night, the silence from my parents' side of the family was deafening. No more texts, no more calls, at least none that I could see after blocking their numbers. For years, I had begged for scraps of their attention, twisting myself into someone they might finally recognize. Now, I had cut the cord. It hurt, like amputating a part of my body, but I couldn't deny the relief that crept in with every passing day. The weight that had pressed against my chest since childhood was finally lifting. Lucas was my anchor. He never once asked me to soften, never once suggested I was too harsh. Instead, he held me when the tears came, cooked dinner when I couldn't stand in the kitchen, and reminded me with every touch that I wasn't broken, I was rebuilding. Grandma Rose stayed with us more often after that. She said the cottage in Olympia felt too empty now, too haunted by memories of birthdays and holidays where she had watched my parents dismiss me. She liked Seattle better, she said, the hum of the city, the rain tapping the windows. One night, as we sat with mugs of chamomile tea, she looked at me with misty eyes. You know, Nora, you've already done what I wish I had. You walked away from people who kept wounding you, even though they share your blood. That takes courage most never find. I pressed her hand. I only did it because you showed me it was possible to be loved without conditions. She smiled, but sadness lingered in the corners of her eyes. A few weeks later, Aunt Betty reached out. She was my mother's sister, the only one who had spoken up after my brothers mocked my wedding. She drove up from Portland with a trunk full of books and a warm hug that smelled faintly of old paper and cinnamon. I should have said something years ago, she admitted, setting a stack of novels on our coffee table. I saw what they were doing, but I stayed quiet. I'm sorry for that. Her apology cracked something in me I didn't know was still frozen. For once, a family member besides Grandma Rose was willing to name the truth. You don't have to be sorry, I told her, blinking back tears. You're here now. That's enough. From then on, Aunt Betty became a regular presence in our lives, bringing stories from her bookstore, recommending novels to Lucas, slipping me sketch pads with a conspiratorial wink. The surprising part was how many others reached out after the reunion explosion. Cousins I hadn't spoken to in years messaged me online. Some admitted they'd seen the favoritism but didn't know how to step in. Others just sent words of encouragement. It wasn't a tidal wave of support, but it was enough to remind me that family isn't always defined by who shares your last name. Sometimes, family is who chooses to stand beside you when the storm hits. Our apartment became that sanctuary. Every thrifted chair, every painting I hung, every secondhand mug was a piece of the life Lucas and I had carved with our own hands. On weekends, we cooked big dinners, the smell of garlic and basil filling the air, laughter spilling from our mismatched chairs. One evening, as I chopped vegetables for a meal, Lucas snapped a photo of me laughing with Grandma Rose and Aunt Betty in the background. The room glowed with lamplight, warm and golden. Later, I posted the picture online with a caption, "New home, true family, grateful for those who've been here through it all." As I hit post, a wave of calm washed over me. Not defiance, not bitterness, just peace. The calls from my parents never stopped entirely, though I never picked them up again. Occasionally, Lucas would glance at my phone buzzing on the counter and ask, "Do you want to?" I always shook my head. No, not anymore. I wasn't interested in apologies wrapped in excuses. I wasn't interested in bargaining for love that should have been mine freely from the beginning. For the first time in my life, I didn't need their approval. That night, as rain tapped the windows and pasta simmered on the stove, we all sat down together. Lucas, Grandma Rose, Aunt Betty, and me. Our table was small, plates mismatched, cups chipped, but it was perfect. I looked at them, laughter bubbling around the room, stories spilling from Aunt Betty about some book club drama, Lucas's hand warm over mine, Grandma Rose humming softly to herself. My heart felt full, overflowing in a way I had never experienced at any holiday table growing up. This was my family, not the one I was born into, but the one I chose, the one that chose me back. I had fought for this, against years of silence, against cruelty disguised as jokes, against the gnawing ache of being invisible. And now, sitting in that golden lamplight, I realized I had finally won. Because family isn't the people who share your blood. It's the people who show up, who believe in you, who love you without keeping score. And as I looked around that table, I knew I was home.